She stood frozen, apron in hand, as the CEO pointed toward the door and shouted, "You're fired." Her only crime? Feeding a hungry, trembling veteran who couldn't pay. The room fell into stunned silence. But at a corner booth, a man quietly folded his napkin and stood. No one knew him. Yet within 24 hours, the entire diner and the CEO's life would be turned upside down. This is the story of kindness, arrogance, and a billionaire's hidden test. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. Every morning before sunrise, Ava Daniels tied her apron, packed a small lunch, and walked to the downtown diner where she'd worked for the past 5 years. The coffee was always bitter, the booths always creaked, and the tips barely paid for groceries, but it was honest work. Ava, a soft-spoken black woman in her late 20s, took pride in how she treated customers, with kindness, attention, and dignity. She knew most regulars by name, remembered how they liked their eggs, and always offered a warm smile, even when the world didn't smile back. The diner wasn't in the best part of town. It catered to truckers, night shift workers, and the occasional suit rushing in with a laptop. Ava had learned to ignore the stares when customers asked to be seated, away from her section, or when sure patrons called her girl instead of using her name. It wasn't right, but it was how things were. She needed the job. Rent wasn't going to pay itself. One cold Thursday morning, a frail older man shuffled in, dragging his coat behind him. His cheeks were red from the wind, and his hands trembled. As he lowered himself into a booth, Ava noticed the military pins on his cap and the exhaustion in his eyes. He had the look of someone hungry, not just for food, but for dignity. She offered him coffee and water, even though he hadn't ordered. He smiled gratefully and whispered that he couldn't pay. Ava's heart tightened. Without thinking, she brought him a hot plate, eggs, toast, and sausage on the house. She didn't know the manager had seen everything. What she also didn't know was that this small act of kindness would cost her everything and open the door to something she never imagined. The diner had always been strict about policy. No freebies, no handouts, especially not to people who looked like they were taking advantage. Ava had heard those words more times than she could count. Still, she couldn't bring herself to ignore the veteran's need. It wasn't about rules, it was about humanity. She returned to the kitchen to grab extra napkins when she heard her name barked from across the room. It was Carl, the manager. Stocky, red-faced, and always on edge, Carl stormed up to her, eyes bulging with frustration. "You just gave away food without ringing it up," he hissed. Ava tried to explain. It was a veteran. He was freezing. He hadn't eaten. Carl didn't care. "You're not paid to make charity decisions. You're paid to follow orders." The room fell quiet. Even the cook stopped flipping pancakes. Ava felt eyes on her, the veteran shrinking into his seat. Carl didn't lower his voice. He turned to the room and said, "We don't give out freebies here. Anyone who does won't be working here long." Ava swallowed hard. "Then maybe I don't want to work somewhere that punishes kindness." Without another word, Carl snatched her apron off and told her to leave. Fired. Just like that. For feeding a hungry old man. Tears stung her eyes as she stepped outside. The wind slapped her face, but it was nothing compared to the sting in her chest. She sat on the curb, her breath fogging in the cold air. No job. No backup plan. Inside, the veteran slowly stood. He shuffled over to the register, pulling a crumpled $10 bill from his pocket and placing it gently on the counter. "I didn't ask for free," he said quietly. "She just saw I needed help." Carl scoffed and walked away. Moments later, the diner door opened again. A man stepped in, tall, sharply dressed, with a presence that made heads turn. He glanced around, then walked straight up to the veteran. "Sir," he said, offering a hand. "I saw what happened from my car, and I saw what she did for you." The man introduced himself as Malcolm Langston, a well-known investor and philanthropist, though Carl clearly didn't recognize him. Malcolm walked outside, found Ava still sitting on the curb, and offered her something she never expected. Not just a job, but a purpose. The next morning, news vans crowded in front of the diner. Someone had recorded the entire incident, Carl's shouting, Ava's quiet dignity, and the veteran's humble gratitude. By sunrise, it had gone viral, but the real shock came later that afternoon. Malcolm Langston hosted a press conference on the steps of a newly renovated building just blocks away. Standing beside Ava, he shared the story. How she chose compassion over policy, how she lost her job for doing what was right, and how kindness, genuine, selfless kindness, deserves reward, not punishment. Then he turned to her and handed her a key. "To honor people like Ava," he announced, "I'm launching a community cafe where no one will be turned away hungry. And Ava Daniels will run it." The crowd erupted. Ava stood frozen, tears in her eyes. In a world where she had been overlooked, underpaid, and disrespected, she was now being lifted, not for the asking, but for giving, not for ambition, but for compassion. Carl watched from inside the diner, his face pale. And the veteran? He stood in the front row, saluting Ava with trembling hands. The world had just flipped in a way no one could have predicted. Ava didn't just take the job, she transformed it. Within months, Ava's place became more than a cafe. It became a refuge. Veterans, the unhoused, single parents, and anyone who needed a meal found more than food inside. They found respect. She ran it with the same grace she once brought to her shifts at the diner, only now she had the power to make real change. And the veteran who once sat silently at that corner booth. He came by every morning early, to stack chairs and brew the first pot of coffee. People drove in from other cities just to see the woman whose kindness sparked a movement. Donations poured in. Volunteers lined up, but Ava never let it go to her head. She said, "It's not about me, it's about what we do with the chances we're given." The old diner, once a symbol of cold policy, saw a sharp decline in customers. Eventually it closed its doors. But Ava's doors? They stayed wide open. Her story reminds us that sometimes doing what's right comes at a cost. But it's always worth it. In a world too often divided by prejudice and greed, one act of decency can ripple into something far greater than we imagine. How many people are passed over every day just for doing good in the wrong place? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and fresh videos.